Hi everyone and welcome to episode 111 of the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. Well, this topic's been simmering away all year and I've been waiting for probably the market to take off to really take the topic to the next level, but hasn't quite happened yet. But the discussions around underquoting certainly won't disappear, and there's been a lot of it going on. Predominantly driven at this stage by The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, who've had some significant coverage under their investigation known as Bidding Blind. So they've spoken to a lot of industry experts, real estate agents, buyers advocates, property advisors, media commentators, that sort of thing, to get different perspectives. And really what it's revealed, which has been known for an extended period of time now, is that there are still a great deal of frustrations from a buyer's perspective. They're feeling a lot of difficulties around trying to assess property's value and trying to buy property successfully. The costs obviously associated with going down the path of trying to buy a property and then finding that because it's been underquoted that it's not really within your budget or your price range and you've spent money unnecessarily. And obviously that then develops into anger and people get really, really frustrated with it. Now, as a property advisor, we obviously see things from both sides of the fence. We work both with buyers and with vendors. It's probably how we differentiate quite significantly from a traditional buyer's advocate. Obviously, that's never on the same transaction, but it does give us a fairly unique perspective on what's going on in the market, but also the pressures that vendors face, but also the pressures that buyers face, and whether or not and it's a discussion that we have quite regularly with our buying clients around, well, this is the chance you are of buying this property. Is it something that we still want to progress with based on the fact that there will be costs associated with doing due diligence to a degree? So given the chances, is it something we still want to progress? So that's something that we speak with on a regular basis to make sure that if we are going to, that clients are doing it with their eyes wide open. But buying and selling property is a very emotive experience, from both sides. So it's something that needs to be taken into account. From a seller's perspective, properties in many instances have been in families for years, if not generations, and there's been a lot of emotion attached to it when families have been brought up in these properties. And perhaps the property is being sold to set up for retirement or to fund the next stage of life. So there's emotion there. And obviously from a buyer's perspective, there's extreme emotion around preparing for an auction. It's a nerve-wracking time. You spend a lot of money. It's probably at that stage, particularly for first-time buyers, one of the biggest decisions that you'll ever make. And so the nerves and the emotion attached to that, and the fact that many buyers get to the point prior to an auction where they've visualised themselves moving in and how they're going to set the property up and what they're going to do and the parties that they're going to have. So there's a lot of emotion attached on that side as well. Now, in terms of underquoting, it's obviously most prevalent around the auction process. With a private sale, typically with a private sale, there'll be a target price and that would be the dream result for the vendor. The buyer will most likely negotiate and work backwards from there, subject to the competition that they may have. From an auction perspective, obviously the emotion is therefore attached, and the auction process is a very nerve-wracking process too for both sides of things. But there are pros and cons. Now, from a negative perspective, as I said, it is very intimidating for those that don't do it on a daily basis and have only, in many instances, will only do it perhaps a handful of times in their lifetime. It is very intimidating. It can be very difficult to determine where you should stop bidding and where you might need to go to around the bidding side of things. And it moves really, really quickly. So having to make a decision with pressure, I mean, most auctions, particularly if there's competitive bidding, probably don't last much longer than 10 or 15 minutes. So that pressure to make a decision in that amount of time is really difficult to deal with. But probably one of the pros, and I really don't think this gets spoken about often enough, is the transparency that the auction process offers. Now, if we moved solely to a private sale process and that was all that we did, I guarantee you there will be negatives around that buyers will focus on. And usually what we find when we do move into that market, and there are certainly a lot of segments of that in Melbourne where private sale is the preferred method, is that when there's competition in that space, the transparency disappears. And most people then crave for the opportunity to know whether or not there actually genuinely is another that the auctioneer, that the agent in that instance is talking about. Am I genuinely got some competition? Have they genuinely got another offer, or am I just bidding against myself and paying more than what I really need to? Whereas with the auction process, you get to eyeball the person that you're bidding against. You can see them across. You can determine how much you want to bid. You can determine when you want to stop. You can determine what increments you want to increase in. So there's a lot of control in that process from a buyer's perspective, which I sometimes think gets lost. So it's not to say that it's perfect. By no means is it, the auction process, but there are a lot of benefits with that as well. And there are negatives too. So what I wanted to do today was not so much focus on the pros and cons. I think that's been revealed enough through through some of the investigations, and the as I said before, the process that the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald put through is very thorough, and there's a lot of information there. I wanted to give you more of a practical sense around what we're seeing on the ground, the experiences that we have, and to try and give it from a bit of context as well. So there's a lot from a buyer's perspective, which I think is very relevant, and it makes it really tough from a buyer's point of view. But there are sides of things where the quoting process has determined an outcome that perhaps may not have been expected, and it may not necessarily have been expected by the vendor where it ended up. So I've got 3 practical examples of auctions that we've been involved with and attended throughout 2025. So they're practical, recent examples. And I thought they've all been really interesting outcomes for differing reasons. And obviously for privacy and those sorts of things, I'm not going to reveal exact addresses, but it will hopefully give you some context as to what we're dealing with. So the first one is a property in the inner northern suburbs that I looked at earlier this year. And it was a house in the northern suburbs on a block of about 550 odd square metres. No heritage overlay on this. So we were looking at this for a property for a client who was planning to do some, to demolish and rebuild. Really liked it. Fantastic street, really attractive, good access to public transport and to a local village. It was quoted at the time of 1.6 to 1.65. The interesting thing about this one is that there'd been another house in the street sell earlier that same month. So very, very recently. Same side of the street, same land size, very similar conditions, slightly different size of house. The previous one was a 3-bedroom, this one was a 2, but the actual building size was not overly different. And that property earlier in the month had sold for 1.67. So given the slightly larger nature of that house, given the compared to the one that was currently for sale, the 1.6 to 1.65 quote was very realistic and very reflective of market conditions at the time. The subject property went to market, had a good campaign. There was 5 bidders on the day of the auction, of which I was one, not successful in the end, I might add. And it ended up selling for 1.855. So we're talking nearly $200,000 more. And given what the market conditions had been, they hadn't changed at all in 2025 at that stage. It was very similar properties, but how an agent or a vendor could have expected an extra 200,000 off of the result that had occurred up the street, where that property had passed in. It hadn't sold under the hammer. It passed in and sold after auction for 1.67. So the quote was reflective. The vendor's expectations were reflective. It's just that the buyers took it well and truly beyond. So that's one case study. And it certainly gave a really good example of where market actions were, but extra bidders, and all of a sudden you get a few more people coming out of the woodwork, and there goes the price. The next one was in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, and it was an older style 3-bedroom townhouse. Good condition, but just a little bit dated internally. This was in a development of around 14 or 15 townhouses in a really good, again, location, good access to public transport, local village. Now, the most recent sale in this block was back in 2021, and it was $990,000. Now, given the market had turned down since then, 2021 was probably when we were at our peak at the back end of COVID, and things certainly softened through 2022 and 23. The quote on the new townhouse within this development to sell was $880 to $950. So about right, again, reflective of most recent sales, and there hadn't been any other sales in and around the area that suggested anything alternate. But the campaign did not start well with this one, and I came through it on the very last weekend before the auction, and the quote had then been reduced from the original quote of $880 to $950 down to $8 to $850 to try and garner some interest and reflect the vendor's expectations and the fact that the vendor was keen to sell. And so as a result of that, it started to generate more interest and there was more competition. And so the agent was a little bit flummoxed in the sense that he said, well, look, I quoted where I thought it realistically should be and didn't get that. And now that I've quoted it less, it's generating interest. Perhaps that's where it should have been all along. And that's where we're now getting to. So again, auction was very well attended, a really good crowd. There was 5 bidders at this one. And it ended up selling for $1.03 million. So not only above the new quote range, but above the original quote range, which was reflective. So the interesting thing here is that buyers didn't come along when it was an accurate quote, but when the quote was reduced to be at a lower level, they all came in and still took it up above what was well and truly above what the vendor's expectations were. So again, a good result. Agent doing the right thing around the quote, buyers just wanting the property and taking it up to another level. So again, just an interesting note. And then the third one was one more recently again, and it was in a eastern suburbs again, sought after location in a sought after secondary school zone. So the zones, obviously, for a lot of you that will know that in Melbourne, school zones, particularly for some of the public secondary schools, are very sought after and very popular. This unit was one of 2, but it was actually on its own title. So it gave it a bit of exclusivity down a driveway to access at the rear, but no common property, which gave it a bit of a point of difference. And certainly meant that it was better than, say, a traditional 2-bedroom villa unit, but perhaps not as good as a 2-bedroom house that would probably have had its own street frontage, that type of thing. So a bit of a difference there. Quote for this one reflected that. Villa units were probably more in the 800s. Proper houses were up in the 1.2 to 1.3 type range. So the quote was 850 to 935 on this one. This one had a strong campaign, went really well from the start. They had really strong interest all the way through. And the auction in the end had 7 bidders on it, so really, really competitive. But 5 pulled out around the one, or all 5 of them had pulled out by the time it got to $1.1 million. So again, significantly above, but a little bit difficult to assess. It ended up going up to 1.35 mil, so well and truly above. But what I found out afterwards, speaking to the agents, was that the 2 people that took it up to that level both lived in the immediate vicinity of this property and were both looking at it and looking to buy the property for family members because they wanted them to be close to home. So the market didn't see value there, but that's where the point of difference comes in, that the buyers had a personal need for that location. If you took it up and put it perhaps 2 blocks further over, that same property, even though it would still be a similar area, they most likely wouldn't have purchased it because it wouldn't have been close enough to their home. So that personal interest is hard to ascertain from a market value perspective. In fact, it doesn't really reflect what would be the traditional definition of market value, which is an arm's length transaction. Now, when you've got people who've got a vested interest like that, it makes it difficult to ascertain, and sometimes that's what can happen. The market can jump ahead. So I guess what my point of today's podcast, and just to give some balance and some context, is that it's difficult to just look solely at the quote and solely then at the sale price and say, well, it sold for a lot more than what they were quoting, therefore it's underquoting. Because there are plenty of examples where agents absolutely do underquote, where they know full well that a property is going to sell up here, but they quote it down here just to generate interest. And that is really wrong, and it should not be done. But there are also plenty of examples where buyers get in their own way, or buyers drive it to that certain level. And I think it's really important to get that balance, or get an understanding of that balance right. And the thing to remember as a buyer is that the quote price is only part of the assessment of value. We very rarely rely on a quote price when we're assessing our property's values. It's a check method, and it can certainly sometimes be used to your advantage if a property passes in. But in terms of assessing where a property sits, it's not what we rely on. As an example, when you look to buy a property, there'll be a contract of sale, which is prepared by the vendor's solicitor, so the vendor's representative. And doing your appropriate due diligence, you would get that as a buyer checked by your own legal representative to make sure that there's not things in there that are against your best interests. And a quote is similar to that in the sense that it reflects the vendor's expectations and what the vendor wants and what the agent might think. Now, it might be below, But you then do your own due diligence to see what you think price is and where you think price should be and where you think you should draw a line in the sand and say, look, I don't think it's worth beyond this, but it's certainly worth more than what you're saying. Or in some circumstances, I think your quote's too high and I'm not paying that. So I'll let you go to market and test it. And if someone wants to pay it, good luck to them. But if they don't, then I'm prepared to have a chat to you about something a bit more realistic. So I think there's just a bit of a balance there, and doing your own homework and doing your own assessments is really important so that you can determine what you think is fair value for a property purchase. So that's about it for today's episode. Thanks for joining me for episode 111 of the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. Please feel free to share the podcast far and wide. Sign up and subscribe to all of our social media, particularly YouTube if possible, and also to your favourite podcast channels. Otherwise, if you need further property information, visit our website, wakeland.com.au, and otherwise we wish you all the best.